No one outside the courthouse expected the moment that was about to unfold. It was supposed to be quiet, just another ordinary day where lawyers moved in and out, reporters waited for statements, and security watched from a distance. Then a familiar figure appeared, calm, composed, unmistakable. Manny Pacquiao stepped outside, not surrounded by chaos, not demanding attention, but moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Most people noticed him immediately. Some whispered, some reached for their phones. A few smiled, recognizing a global icon standing just a few feet away. But not everyone reacted with respect. Across the street, a small group of bikers watched with amusement. Loud, confident, untouchable, or at least that's what they believed. To them, this wasn't a legend. This was entertainment. A chance to feel powerful in front of cameras and strangers. It started with words, mocking comments, smirks, a tone meant to belittle. Nothing dramatic, just enough to cross a line, just enough to test boundaries. People nearby froze, unsure whether to step in or look away. Security shifted their posture. Phone stayed raised, and then something unexpected happened. Manny Pacquiao stopped walking. He turned slightly, not with anger, not with fear, but with complete control. His expression didn't change. No argument, no reaction that could be clipped and twisted online. Just silence. That silence did something strange to the crowd. The bikers laughed louder, mistaking calm for weakness. They leaned into the moment, unaware that every second was being recorded, not just by phones, but by systems designed to remember everything. Angles they couldn't see, witnesses they didn't notice. This wasn't a street confrontation. This was a test of character. To outsiders, it looked small. A few words exchanged. A celebrity ignoring hecklers. Nothing newsworthy. But beneath the surface, something irreversible had already begun. Because moments like these don't end when the cameras stop rolling. They end when consequences arrive. And as Manny Pacquiao quietly stepped forward and disappeared into the courthouse, one truth became clear. The bikers believed the moment was over. In reality, it had just started. The bikers thought they had won. They were loud, brash, leaning on their bikes as if the entire street belonged to them. Their smirks were wide, fueled by adrenaline and the thrill of public attention. Every gesture, every taunt was meant to provoke a reaction. To them, Manny Pacquiao was just another man. A famous one, yes, but still human. And humans, they assumed, reacted. Humans, they assumed, showed anger, fear, or at least irritation. But Manny didn't. He didn't shout. He didn't flinch. He didn't respond in the way the bikers had expected. He didn't even glance at them in anger. Instead, he stopped walking for a moment and simply stood there. Calm, collected, imposing, not with force, but with presence. The effect was immediate. The laughter that had been echoing off the courthouse walls faltered. The confident voices wavered. The sense of control the bikers had assumed so effortlessly began to crack. People around them noticed it too. The whispers of witnesses grew louder than the bikers' taunts. Phones still recording, capturing every motion, every subtle glance, every unspoken tension. For a moment, the bikers were unsure. They looked at each other, trying to find reassurance. Were they overreacting? Was this man going to finally retaliate? Or worse, were they already stepping into a situation they didn't understand? Silence, when wielded correctly, is a weapon more powerful than anger. And Manny Pacquiao wielded it perfectly. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Every second that passed, the bikers realized that their mockery had no effect. Their arrogance, no matter how loud, was irrelevant. The silence around him was not emptiness. It was a storm building quietly. It was control, authority. It was the calm before consequences they could not yet see. Witnesses began to pay attention. Casual passers-by stopped mid-step, sensing tension in the air. Security subtly shifted closer. Cameras, both official and personal, continued recording, capturing the bikers in a way they couldn't predict. Every smirk, every cocky gesture, every laugh would later tell the story of a moment they had underestimated. The bikers tried to fill the silence. A joke, a challenge, a louder laugh. But each attempt only emphasized the imbalance they hadn't realized existed. The street, once theirs by assumption, now seemed smaller. The laughter fell hollow. Their bravado, previously unstoppable, now teetered on the edge of uncertainty. Manny Pacquiao finally took a step forward, and the bikers instinctively moved back. Not out of fear of a punch, not because of aggression, but because they instinctively recognized power. He wasn't threatening them. He wasn't attacking them. He was simply there, and that was enough. For anyone watching closely, it was a lesson in composure, a demonstration of authority without aggression, an example that true strength doesn't always shout. It commands attention quietly. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply is. In those moments, the bikers had a choice: walk away, retreat, or escalate. They thought they had the upper hand. But what they didn't understand was that silence had already turned the tide against them. By the time Manny Pacquiao disappeared back into the courthouse, leaving the bikers in stunned confusion, one thing was already clear. They had lost something far greater than pride. And the world, or at least those capturing every moment, would make sure they remembered it. Because some lessons don't arrive with shouts. They arrive with silence. Moments passed, but the tension on the street did not fade. The bikers stood frozen, trying to regain their composure, but the feeling that something had shifted lingered like a shadow over them. They had underestimated the situation, underestimated the presence of a legend, underestimated the weight of silent authority. And what they didn't know was that every action they had taken was being recorded in ways they could never anticipate. Phones in the crowd were still rolling. People who had stopped to watch weren't just recording for social media. They were recording because the air had changed, because what they were witnessing was more than just a confrontation. It was a story unfolding before their eyes. Every laugh, every taunt, every cocky movement from the bikers was captured. But that was only the beginning. Security cameras positioned around the courthouse had been quietly observing the scene from above, their lenses sweeping across the street. Unblinking, impersonal, precise. Every angle, every interaction, every subtle movement, everything recorded, stored, cataloged. These weren't just cameras. They were silent witnesses, impartial and permanent. And in moments like these, silent witnesses could be more dangerous than 1,000 angry voices. Manny Pacquiao himself didn't even need to look back. He didn't need to gesture or threaten. His calm presence, combined with the subtle, all-seeing surveillance, created a situation that the bikers couldn't manipulate or control. They had thought they were playing with a man. They were actually performing for a global audience, one they didn't even realize existed. And it wasn't just the cameras. There were other witnesses, ordinary people who understood fame, influence, and respect. People who knew who Manny Pacquiao was, and more importantly, who understood the consequences of underestimating him. Phones clicked, whispers spread, and the crowd's energy subtly shifted. The laughter of the bikers began to fade, replaced by confusion. It was a quiet kind of tension, but it was palpable. The bikers tried to reassert control, leaning on their bikes, smirking, pretending nothing had changed. But the shift was undeniable. They could feel it. Every person around them could feel it. The story had already left their hands. It was no longer about their arrogance. It was about what comes after arrogance. By now, the footage from multiple angles was already circulating, though in the moment, the bikers had no idea. Each person recording, each camera capturing the scene, was creating a digital footprint that would not be erased. A misstep, a sneer, a gesture meant to intimidate. All of it was now part of a permanent record. And in the digital age, records like these are rarely forgotten. The bikers' bravado started to crack. Subtle glances at each other betrayed the unspoken realization that they might have gone too far. Their laughter became hollow, their posture uncertain. The quiet power of presence, combined with technology, with witnesses, with authority, was beginning to turn the tables. Meanwhile, Manny Pacquiao disappeared back into the courthouse without a word, leaving behind only a silent, almost invisible message: actions have consequences. The bikers were still there, frozen in a mix of shock and disbelief, unaware that the cameras had already done their work. Because in moments like these, the truth doesn't need to be shouted. It doesn't need to be forced. It is simply recorded. It is observed. And later, when the time comes, it is impossible to ignore. The bikers had thought they were untouchable. That day, standing on that street, they learned a quiet but unforgettable truth. Every action leaves a mark, and every mark can be seen, even when you think no one is watching. And this was just the beginning. The silent witnesses, the cameras, the crowd, they would all play a role in what came next. Karma, it seemed, had a way of operating quietly, strategically, and invisibly, and the bikers had already stepped into its path. By the time the street emptied, the story had already begun circulating in whispers, captured forever in pixels, ready to unfold its consequences. And the bikers, still unaware, believed they had walked away unscathed. They hadn't. Minutes had passed since Manny Pacquiao disappeared inside the courthouse, yet the air outside was thick with unease. The bikers leaned against their motorcycles, trying to appear casual, but every glance over the shoulder betrayed a creeping doubt. The laughter that had once filled the street was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence, as if the city itself had paused to watch what would happen next. At first, they didn't understand what was happening. They had assumed the moment was theirs, a public display of power, a story they could laugh about later. But then it began, subtle gestures from the crowd, pointing phones, whispered comments, and knowing glances. The bikers tried to laugh it off, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Something invisible was unfolding, and they were already in the middle of it. Then came a call. It was brief. A single voice on the other end, calm, controlled, and unyielding. No threats, no shouting, just information. Facts, names, associations, connections that the bikers had no idea existed, people and organizations that moved quietly but with immense power. They laughed at first, thinking it was a prank. Surely, no one could act on this so quickly, so decisively. But then, as they tried to brush it off, the first signs of consequence appeared. A message, a missed call, another call, each one reinforcing the realization that this was no ordinary day. This wasn't about reputation alone. It was about influence, networks, and accountability. And the bikers had inadvertently triggered a chain reaction. As minutes turned into moments, their confidence began to crack. One of them, the loudest and most arrogant of the group, checked his phone again and again, growing increasingly tense with each notification. The information he was receiving wasn't just about himself. It was about the consequences of the day's arrogance, the ripple effect caused by a single lapse in judgment. The crowd around them noticed the shift. Passers-by, who had initially been spectators, now whispered among themselves, sensing that something bigger was happening. Security personnel shifted subtly, their eyes scanning, not aggressively, but with awareness. Phones continued recording, capturing the subtle tremors of fear and confusion spreading across the bikers' faces. They didn't know it yet, but their actions had been documented in detail. Every gesture, every word, every movement preserved in digital memory. The call, the notifications, the sudden awareness of scrutiny, it all converged to deliver a single message. Power and reputation are inseparable, and disrespect has consequences. The bikers tried to regain control. One of them muttered a joke, another forced a smile, hoping to hide the growing panic. But the calm, measured authority of the situation was impossible to break. This was not about confrontation anymore. It was about accountability, silent yet unstoppable. By the time they looked up, the street had emptied slightly, and the reality of what they had started began to sink in. They were no longer the ones in control. They had underestimated the reach, the influence, and the quiet authority of a legend who didn't need to raise his voice. And somewhere, in the quiet aftermath, the chain reaction continued to unfold. Messages were sent. Notifications arrived. People connected. The bikers could feel it, the invisible web of consequences slowly tightening around them. Every smug gesture, every laugh, every moment of arrogance that seemed harmless minutes ago was now a liability. By the time the day truly began to settle, one truth was undeniable. The bikers had unknowingly stepped into a storm they could not escape. The call, brief and calm as it was, had set into motion a sequence of events that would change everything. Manny Pacquiao, calm and composed, had already left the street. He hadn't needed to shout, to threaten, or to act. The silent, strategic presence, combined with a single, well-placed call, had already begun rewriting the biker story. What they thought was a small, inconsequential moment had already become the turning point of their lives. Because sometimes, the most powerful actions are the quietest. And this quiet action had just begun to be why the next morning, the bikers began to realize that their arrogance had a price. What started as a moment of thoughtless bravado outside the courthouse was no longer contained to a single street. Phones were buzzing, notifications piling up with messages from friends, associates, and people they hadn't spoken to in years. Their actions had been captured, not just on bystanders' phones, but on official security footage, uploaded to networks that moved faster than any motorcycle could. At first, they tried to shrug it off. "It's just a few clips," one muttered, attempting to brush it off as trivial. Another laughed nervously, hoping that the storm would pass, that the world would forget as quickly as it had begun. But reality, as they were about to learn, has a way of catching up, and it never forgets. The first signs appeared subtly. Sponsors that had once supported them paused their collaborations. Clubs that had welcomed them without question now became distant, silent. Invitations disappeared. Messages went unanswered, and whispers followed them wherever they went. People who had admired their daring now questioned their judgment. The bikers, who had once felt untouchable, were suddenly facing an invisible wall they could not ride through. It wasn't just the professional consequences. Public opinion had shifted dramatically. Videos of their arrogance, paired with their stunned reactions as Manny Pacquiao walked away, began circulating on social media. Comments flooded in, shock, disappointment, disbelief. People admired the calm, the restraint, the authority of Manny Pacquiao, while the bikers were dissected, replayed, and criticized online. They had miscalculated. Every smirk, every laugh, every gesture had been recorded and amplified. Their reputation, once a shield of confidence, was now a target for judgment, both online and offline. They could no longer act as if the moment hadn't happened. Every interaction now carried the shadow of that day. Every friend, every colleague, every casual observer aware of their public lapse in judgment. Inside the biker circle, tension grew. Arguments sparked over minor mistakes. Who had egged on the confrontation? Who had laughed too loudly? The cracks in their camaraderie appeared quickly, fueled by fear and the creeping realization that their actions had consequences far beyond what they had imagined. Confidence was replaced by paranoia. Bravado became hesitation. And hesitation is a dangerous state when your reputation is unraveling in real time. Meanwhile, the public continued to witness the aftermath. News outlets, without sensationalizing, reported the incident as a story of respect, influence, and consequence. Commentators praised Manny Pacquiao for his composure and restraint. Analysts highlighted how the bikers' arrogance had backfired, turning a brief moment of confrontation into a cautionary tale about humility, presence, and accountability. For the bikers, every interaction became a reminder. A simple phone call, a missed message, a hesitant nod from a former associate, all carried the weight of their mistake. The street outside the courthouse was no longer just a location. It was a mental image that followed them, replaying in their minds every time they tried to justify what had happened. And slowly, painfully, they began to understand that this wasn't just a lesson in pride. It was a lesson in consequences. Every choice has weight. Every action leaves a mark. And some marks, once made, cannot be erased. By the end of the day, reality had settled over them like an unshakable fog. Their careers, their social standing, their perceived invincibility, all of it had been chipped away by a single misjudgment. A misjudgment amplified not by force, but by quiet strength, by presence, and by the power of silent observation. Manny Pacquiao, meanwhile, continued with his day, unaffected, calm, respected, untouchable. He hadn't raised a hand, hadn't uttered a threat, yet the biker's world had already shifted irreversibly. And in that shift, one truth emerged. Arrogance may give the illusion of power, but true strength is measured by patience, restraint, and the ability to command respect without raising your voice. The bikers had learned it the hard way, and the lesson would follow them everywhere for the rest of their lives. That'd be why the time the footage made its way online, the bikers' perception of reality had already begun to crumble. What they once thought of as a fleeting, inconsequential moment had become a story shared across platforms, replayed, dissected, and analyzed. In the digital age, reputation is not just built on action, it's built on perception. And perception can be unforgiving. News outlets picked up the story carefully, highlighting the sequence of events with attention to detail. They didn't sensationalize with violence or exaggeration. Instead, they focused on the quiet power of Manny Pacquiao, the calm, the restraint, the authority, juxtaposed with the biker's overconfidence. Viewers saw every gesture, every laugh, every failed attempt at intimidation. Public sentiment began to shift instantly. The narrative was no longer about a celebrity being bothered. It was about arrogance meeting consequence. Social media became a magnifying glass. Clips were shared, stitched into compilations, and captioned with phrases like "don't underestimate calm authority" or "silence speaks louder than threats." Every viewer who watched the videos felt the tension, the imbalance of power, and the inevitable fallout. The bikers, once the center of their own perceived dominance, became subjects of scrutiny and ridicule. And it wasn't just strangers watching. Colleagues, friends, and associates who had previously admired or tolerated them now began to distance themselves. Messages went unanswered. Invitations disappeared. Even casual interactions carried an unspoken tension, as if everyone who knew them could see the invisible mark left by their actions. For the bikers, this was a slow, relentless reckoning. Every time they checked a phone, every time someone mentioned the incident, the weight of consequence pressed harder. They had thought they could laugh it off, but the world had already decided the outcome. Public opinion, amplified by social media, had sealed the verdict long before any formal punishment could occur. Humiliation, in this case, wasn't physical. It was reputational, and it was far more powerful. Unlike a momentary scare or confrontation, it lingered. It followed them to every interaction, every meeting, every public space they entered. They were no longer in control of the narrative. The story had left their hands, and every replay, every comment, every share reminded them of the one truth they could no longer ignore. Arrogance has consequences. Meanwhile, Manny Pacquiao's calm, measured presence continued to dominate the narrative. Analysts highlighted how restraint, silence, and dignity could neutralize aggression without a single act of violence. Fans and casual viewers alike praised him not for strength or fame, but for composure, a lesson many had forgotten in a world obsessed with confrontation. The biker's world, once so loud and chaotic, had become quiet in comparison. Every interaction was a reminder that they had underestimated someone who didn't need to prove power with action. They had assumed strength was loud and visible, failing to recognize that true authority can be quiet, patient, and calculated. Even as days passed, the clips continued to circulate. Each replay reinforced the lesson. Each share amplified the consequence. The bikers began to understand that the moment outside the courthouse had not been a single incident. It was a turning point. A single miscalculation had created a permanent mark on their reputations, one that would follow them indefinitely. And as they watched the world react, they realized something profound. The truth, once it goes public, is unstoppable. It doesn't need embellishment. It doesn't need confrontation. It simply exists, and its impact is inevitable. By the end of the week, the bikers were no longer the story makers. They were the story, and the world, online and offline, had already passed judgment. Manny Pacquiao, calm as ever, continued his life. His reputation remained untarnished, his authority unquestioned. He didn't need to respond, because the public had already understood the lesson. Humility and composure are more powerful than arrogance and noise. And the bikers? They were left to navigate the aftermath, a lesson in consequence that would echo far longer than their laughter ever could. Because when the truth goes public, it doesn't just change perception, it changes lives. The street was empty now, but the echoes of what had happened lingered like a shadow. For the bikers, every moment of arrogance, every smirk, every laugh outside the courthouse had finally caught up with them. They were no longer untouchable. They were no longer in control. The world had already decided their fate, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Manny Pacquiao, as always, had walked away calm, collected, and completely unbothered. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't even raised his voice. Yet the outcome was undeniable. The bikers' reputations, carefully built on confidence and bravado, had crumbled in minutes. The footage, replayed endlessly online, had turned a fleeting encounter into a permanent lesson. Viewers dissected every second. The bikers' cocky gestures, the sudden faltering of their confidence, the silence that spoke louder than any words. Memes were made, videos compiled. News stories analyzed the incident not as an attack, but as a demonstration of restraint, power, and consequence. For the bikers, this wasn't just embarrassment. It was the unraveling of everything they had relied on: their social standing, their credibility, their influence. Sponsors withdrew. Club memberships were questioned. Public appearances became fraught with tension and doubt. Every interaction they attempted now carried the invisible weight of the courthouse incident, amplified by a world that had already watched and judged. Inside their circle, the tension was unbearable. Arguments broke out over who had done what, who had laughed too loudly, who had misjudged the situation. Fear replaced camaraderie. Confidence became hesitation. The invisible web of consequences, spun by calm observation and a single phone call, had tightened around them inescapably. Meanwhile, Manny Pacquiao's life continued as if nothing had happened. Calm, respected, untouchable. He didn't need to make a scene. He didn't need to retaliate. His presence alone had delivered a lesson so powerful it would echo across the internet for months, maybe years. This was the ultimate lesson. Respect cannot be demanded, it can only be earned. Arrogance, when unchecked, is self-destructive. And the quiet strength of a composed individual can outweigh the loud confidence of many. The bikers had learned this too late. They had underestimated the power of presence, the reach of observation, and the permanence of digital records. Every mistake they made that day had been amplified and preserved. And in the age of the internet, some lessons never fade. As the world continued to replay the incident, one thing became crystal clear. Manny Pacquiao's authority didn't come from aggression or intimidation. It came from composure, discipline, and patience. And that kind of authority cannot be challenged by noise, arrogance, or bluster. The bikers were left with nothing but the consequences of their actions. Their careers faltered. Their pride was broken. Their story became a cautionary tale shared widely, a warning for anyone who thinks they can disrespect without consequence. And Manny? He walked on, unchanged, untouchable, and respected. The street outside the courthouse would never forget what happened that day, and neither would the internet. Because some lessons aren't taught with words. They're taught with silence, presence, and the quiet certainty that actions always have consequences. In the end, one truth remained: disrespect the wrong person, and life has a way of correcting itself. Sometimes quietly, sometimes irreversibly, but always inevitably. The biker's world had collapsed, and the lesson was clear. True strength is quiet, composed, and unshakable, and it leaves a mark that the world never forgets.